And what we're going to be unpacking is some of the different ideas and concepts behind resilience. How does culture interplay with this area? This session was specifically designed for those of you who are working in social justice, human rights, working with trauma survivors, and we will talk through what are some of the areas that we should be looking out for. We will then focus on, at the end, primarily strategies. What can be done? How can we support ourselves and others? Before we start our resilience journey, I'd like to just share a little bit about me to add context to today's session. I'm originally from Melbourne, Australia, and my university, Deakin, that I was with for a very long time, is located there. I am a registered mental health social worker with a PhD in the area of trauma and resilience. My PhD was conducted in Cambodia, and I looked specifically at the area of resilience in the aftermath of intergenerational trauma, child trafficking, and modern-day slavery. I wrapped up my PhD in 2020, and I immigrated to Mauritius, where I'm joining you from today. During this time, I've had many years of clinical practice. I was a clinician primary trauma therapist in Thailand. So I spent approximately 5 years in Southeast Asia, largely divided between Thailand and Cambodia before immigrating. And I've also worked in that trauma space and worked with private clients throughout these years. To begin, resilience, the definition itself, there's not an overall universal agreement on this term. What is it? We hear different language being used to describe resilience. Some of you may have heard the ability to bounce back, the ability to recover after adversity. It does often speak to recovery, to growth. You can see here on this slide, there's various coping mechanisms that someone may draw from. And it's not a universally accepted term. And one area that came out in my research in Cambodia was the term resilience, when translated into Khmer, the local language of Cambodia, is that it means pressure on rubber or the durability of rubber. So it doesn't actually translate particularly well, which is why, for the purpose of my research centered on resilience, I didn't actually use the term resilience in any of my interviews for this particular reason. But there are ways in which we can use to describe what is resilience. And for those of you that are working with trauma survivors or working with communities, you will see elements of resilience, survival, and moving into how to thrive post event and or period of stress. I'd like to share a story of Cambodian resilience. And it was hard for me to select the best story in terms of how do I capture the resilience with my research participants, because I was absolutely inspired and moved by their powerful stories. As I mentioned, many of them had early childhood experiences of trafficking and modern-day slavery. And I met with some of, I would argue, the most resilient humans that I've ever come across. And many of them had been supported by non-government organisations and had access to education and healthcare, and had carved a life out for themselves that involved connection to community, families of their own, occupations and careers that often also incorporated supporting others. And so one story I'd like to share involves a young man that I'd met. And he was trafficked at a young age. He came back to Cambodia and was involved in, well, living on the streets and drug addiction and crime as well as a means for survival. He was picked up and supported by a non-government organisation there. And he tells a story of his grandfather who died when he was 8. and he really wanted to make his grandfather proud. So he was in school with a lot of behavioural issues. He was almost expelled from school as a teenager, but he made this decision. I'm going to learn how to read. I'm going to have a life that my grandfather would be proud of. And the man that I met with was a doctor. He was working in the slums of Cambodia with another NGO, providing health checks for children, some of whom had had a lot of the same trauma experiences that he had had as a child. He was also in his final year of studying surgery. He was an outstanding individual and human. And one of the areas that comes up in resilience is, I'm going to actually start with the second point on this slide. Jung, famous psychotherapist, coined the term wounded healer, and the story that I gave just speaks to this. What Jung said was sometimes people are compelled to work in professions and fields that help others that have either similar stories to their own, or in a way where the healer can actually heal their own wounds through that support of others. And I see this a lot in the human rights field. I also see this in my area. There's been very large studies done in the US around social workers, and one in particular suggested that almost 50% of social workers had been diagnosed with a mental health issue prior to studying social work. We see in addiction therapy, there are many people who have had their own battles with addiction. Same with eating disorders as well. We see that when psychologists specialize in eating disorders, according to one study, 30% of them have had their own lived experiences of eating disorders. So how does that relate to people working in the field? It means that when we are holding space for others' stories and their lived experiences, we may in fact be more susceptible to vicarious trauma, which is a term I'll unpack shortly. And so how do we recognize when we are or potentially moving towards experiencing high stress, burnout, trauma symptoms of our own by holding space for survivors? And this doesn't just happen to wounded healers. It can happen to anyone working in this space. In my current work, I do a lot of work with Fortune 500 companies all over the world. And I was talking to an organization, and this arm was in Kenya. And one participant had commented that they had been submerged in data around HIV spread across Africa. And they were compiling this data. And they found that they needed to take regular breaks much more because of the content and the nature of the research that they were reading was having an impact on their overall sense of well-being. I don't know if this person was had trauma in their history or was connecting to anything specifically, but this is the process of empathy. Empathy starts at a very young age. It's actually created during the years of 0 to 2, and it's done through nursing. Generally the mother, but can be primary carer whilst nursing the child. The mother looks into the eyes of the baby looks into the mother's eyes, and neurons fire at the same time in the mother's brain as it does in the baby's brain. And this process is referred to as mirror neurons. We see this with adults. When you look at two people and their body language is matching, so one might lean in like this and the other matches and leans in like this, the same thing is happening, mirror neurons. So when I say we're wired to connect, we quite literally are. And it means that that process of empathy for people working in the field of human rights can sometimes be a double-edged sword. We can experience the highs. We can experience the success, the wins. We can feel that what we're doing is making a profound difference. We can also share in the survivors that we're supporting, their fear, their pain, and the sadness that goes along with that. And that is part of the process of being a human. So trauma-informed care is based on the idea that there is a very large number of us that has trauma. And trauma can be defined in different ways. In my field, we often use the expression big T or small t trauma to describe an event. A big T trauma might be surviving a natural disaster or an assault of some kind. If someone has adequate coping skills and is well-resourced, there's nothing to say they can't make a full recovery. But sometimes people experience trauma symptoms, nightmares, flashbacks, high anxiety, and other kinds of, I'm just admitting someone else into the session, my apologies for the pause. And so someone might experience these trauma symptoms. Small t trauma, an example of small t is workplace bullying. It means that someone may have ongoing cumulative trauma and they can still suffer from trauma symptoms as a direct result of this. And so what we need to understand is that if a lot of us have experienced trauma, there might be many of us that are, in fact, wounded healers working in this space. And trauma plays a very big part in the work that we do. Now, the term vicarious trauma, as I mentioned at the start, is secondary trauma. It means that you might not have experienced that trauma yourself, but you are exposed to that trauma in your environment. So, for example, vicarious trauma is much higher in terms of rates in my field. People working with disaster relief or frontline responders. These are professions that are exposed to other people's trauma and or suffering. However, the media can interplay with vicarious trauma rates. And we first understood the impact of this after September 11th, when the international media picked up those images and played them on repeat all over the world. And what we found was that all these people who were A, not American, B, had nothing to do with ground zero, were experiencing symptoms of trauma. And the same thing has happened over the last few years. We can turn on the news in any country and we are seeing stories of war, stories of famine and COVID and everything, rising inflation rates. And it's important to know that even if we're not experiencing it directly, if your brain sees it as a threat or a potential threat to your well-being, you might experience that on your stress response as if that threat is very much pending. And so when we're exposed to suffering on an ongoing basis, and that process of mirror neurons and empathy occurs, we can become much more in tune with trauma and experience our own trauma symptoms. Compassion fatigue, burnout, and vicarious trauma share a lot of the same symptoms, and we'll come to that in just a moment. And sometimes people will be asking, what is the difference? So compassion fatigue is very much linked to trauma. It's exposure to trauma or material surrounding that. So whether you are working in a human rights space, but you are in an office, or whether you are, for example, out in the field. I worked on several projects in Myanmar in the human rights space, and I met some incredible social workers working in communities in the area of gender-based violence, nutrition programs, and some of them had had first-hand trauma with military, basically, and being very physically unsafe in communities at times. And they took that into the group and they shared those experiences. Others of them were more around writing nutrition programs, but they were still looking at data and evidence of suffering in the work that they did. So that traumatic material can be firsthand or a step back or secondary. Burnout, on the other hand, is more around stress, and it's not directly linked to trauma. Burnout rates have skyrocketed over the last few years. what we've seen is people have had layers of stress and change put on them. And some of you might be much more adaptable and flexible than others, but none of us enjoy swimming around in uncertainty. It's not a natural resting place for humans. So the more change and the more uncertainty that's in our environment, the higher the level of stress. And when we look at resilience and that ability to bounce back, it's often after a singular event, we can then recover. But if there's one event, then more stress, then more stress and more stress, and it just compounds, burnout is very prevalent as a result. So how do you recognize stress? And I'd like to hear from some of the participants in the group. I am going to open up my chat box for comments. How do you recognize what is a little bit of stress for you, a moderate amount of stress, or potentially overloaded with stress and maybe edging towards burnout? What are some of the signs and symptoms for you? Because for me personally, the clinical term is cognitive confusion, but it's a slowing down of thoughts and actions in the brain. My little bit of stress is when I start one thing, move to another, go back to what I was doing initially, and it's a very chaotic way of working. But in 2020, when I was living in Cambodia and I was in a very remote area, I didn't have my social support network around me. I got very busy because of the state of the world. Everything was online and I was finishing my PhD. The research that I did in Cambodia was life-changing for me, but the final academic stages was just awful. So those factors all together meant that I would sit down, I would be writing a paragraph, and I'd spend 45 minutes incorporating my academic supervisor's feedback, and then I'd be thinking, why is it taking me so long? I'd go away, have a cup of tea, come back and realize I'd spent 45 minutes and I've made it worse. This is cognitive confusion at a moderate level, maybe edging towards burnout. So for some of you, it might be cognitive. In a session recently, I was talking to a group of senior leaders, Fortune 500 tech company, and I was asking them, how do you recognize mental health in your teams? What have you seen? What have you noticed? And a lot of them were talking about how people were getting grumpy, how team members who were normally quite motivated and ready to go were becoming short and snappy or complaining and really pushing back on deadlines or unmotivated, dragging their feet. This can all be stress related. And it's important that you recognize how stress presents on you, because it is never a one size fits all. Stress looks different on different people. So being able to recognize what your symptoms and signs are critical. When I mentioned that burnout, compassion, fatigue, and stress presents similarly, what you're looking at here is this overlap of symptoms. You might find that the difficulty concentrating is there, or your self-care and you looking after your physical health starts to diminish. You might feel that you are exhausted, even though you are getting adequate sleep. So it can be about the physical symptoms, the emotional symptoms, or the cognitive symptoms. The most important is that you recognize your stress signature and we start to respond. I ran a session right across the APAC region. This was in 2021. I will always remember this session because I think this organization was very brave to do what they did. They asked their senior leaders, how many of you have had mental health issues and how many of you would like to talk about that in an open format with people across the APAC region? Now, some of their brave leaders stepped forward. One was talking about anxiety. One was talking about trauma. One was talking about, it was loss, grief and loss. And another talked about burnout. And I was talking to the manager before the session about burnout, and she was explaining to me how she had spent 10 years in senior leadership, always worked really long hours, high stress roles, lived in a pressure cooker. This was not unusual for her. And she said, I started seeing these signs, but I just thought, soldier on, I'll just power through. But she said it got so bad that I couldn't even get out of bed in the morning, and I had to take a month of unpaid leave. And she said, looking back, I still don't understand how this happened to me. And I share that story because it happens to the best of us. People can be very used to living with stress, but we need to be recognizing the cues that our body and our brain give us about when it's becoming too much for us. And then we can put in some action. And now we're going to talk about what kind of action. These are your strategies, your resilience strategies. And just as much as stress doesn't present in the same way on one person, there's no perfect top 3 best strategies for everyone. You're all different individuals and humans, but we're going to talk through what's the evidence base. Let's talk about each of these and maybe have a think about which ones would I like to focus on, which ones appeal to me. Now, if I say to you, healthy body, healthy mind, that might not surprise many of you. We've heard the call out. We know that exercise is good for us, but there's several reasons why exercise is brilliant. One, serotonin. Serotonin is a neurochemical that is released in the brain during exercise. It is a mood stabilizer, and it has been shown to be just as effective in the research as antidepressants in the treatment of mild to moderate cases of depression, and also very effective in the treatment of depression in the elderly. So serotonin is present when we move the body. Also, with exercise, and particularly high intensity exercise or anything that makes you sweat, stress cortisol, which is a hormone that floods the body during peak times of stress, it comes out in our sweat and in our tears. So yes, you could sit in a sauna or a steam room. And for those of you in tropical countries, you might just go outside and start sweating, but you can sweat out your stress quite literally. So if your response to a high stress day is I'm going to go for a run or go to the gym and sweat out my cortisol levels and get serotonin in the brain, this is a fabulous strategy. But you can see here as well, we have nutrition, and our sleep as well is critical as a baseline for well-being. One of the areas that will come up in 2 slides is your social connections. Some of you will work with some brilliant people, and they are your supports. I remember when I was doing my research in Cambodia, one of the NGOs that I worked with and recruited participants from was Hagar International. And I spent much time in their offices, and I would look at some of their social workers and community workers and the way that they would interact with each other. And it warmed my heart, because Hagar supports survivors of trafficking, and some of them were supporting children who had been sexually abused. And that is some really hard, tough work to be doing. And I would see the way that they would communicate with each other and joke and laugh in the lunchroom and talk about when they had a overwhelming experience or feelings. And I could see the closeness and the bond that they had with each other from the other side of the room. It was lovely. And this kind of collective care and creating an environment of psychological safety where you can share what's going on with you, with your colleagues who, if they're doing something similar, are very well placed to understand exactly how you are feeling. Boundaries are hard for people in the helping professions because you are quite literally trying to help people. So often your answer to everything is yes, can do. How do you recognize when it's time to say no? Some of you might really struggle to say no, and I will put my hand up in this category as well. I tend to say yes to lots of things and then try to work it out how I'm going to fit it all in later. But if you're working a lot, it's important that you allocate time for you. What do you enjoy? What activities are important to you? And who is important to you? How can you be incorporating those two things, social connection alongside of activities that you enjoy? And looking towards your self-reflection and awareness. This can also be tough for people who are in the helping professions, because often we know, we give advice for a living. We tell people, yes, we need to reflect on how we're feeling. We need to understand what makes us angry. We need to be looking at triggers. We need to be looking at our overall well-being. But then do we do it ourselves? Because some of you might actually like to take a look at, on Google Images, something called the feelings wheel or wheel of emotion. You'll see a circular diagram. They have been translated into different languages. There's some for children, and all it is a circular diagram of feelings. How do you describe your emotional state? And this can be very different depending on culture, gender, age, early life experience, how your parents talked about emotions. But we use these tools in therapy to help clients recognize their emotional states. And it's a great tool for us as well. My favorite social work researcher, Brene Brown, she's wonderful. And she likes to say that we are capable of, we as in humans, are capable of 70 distinct emotions. I don't know about you, but I would be hard pressed to name 70 emotions. So take a look at this feelings wheel and try to incorporate some of those feelings into your vocabulary, whether it's positive or whether it's negative, because there's neuroscience behind this as well. Neuroscientists tell us that when we name a negative emotion, it can take its power away. Why? Because we experience negative emotions across our neuronal pathways in the same way as physical pain. So if I put my hand in a fire and get burnt, I will experience that across my brain, my brain's neuronal network in a very similar way to emotional pain. So by naming our emotional pain, the brain can say, oh, it's a feeling, it's not physical, and it's not going to physically hurt me. So that's what I mean by taking its power away. But the opposite is for positive emotions. When you get to the end of the week, you finish a project and you think, great, next, and you're off and running on the next thing that might be causing you stress. Take a moment, bring a friend, pat yourself on the back, do a little happy dance, celebrate with your family on the weekend, anything that you can do to just stay in that positive emotion of pride and or gratitude. Okay. So our next area here is mindfulness, and mindfulness can be a bit of a buzzword, meaning it gets thrown around a lot, that we need to be mindful. But mindfulness has been a big part of different religions and different spiritual practices right across the globe for a really long time before psychologists started throwing it around like a buzzword. But mindfulness, you can take an activity and just do that one activity in a mindful way. Neuroscientists tell us that we have 75,000 thoughts per day, of which we're only aware of a fraction of them. So from the moment you are awake and conscious in the morning, your brain is off and running. So having a mindful moment, whether that is breathing exercises, yoga, listening to something on YouTube, doing a sleep talk down, anything that just brings you into the present moment and into your body can be really helpful. But you can also take any other activity. You can mindfully brush your teeth. You can mindfully eat. and just eat the food. Don't answer any emails. Don't look at your phone. Don't do 14 things at once, because that's what the brain often does. And that adds to our stress level by making us more overwhelmed. So mindfulness at various points throughout the day is great for managing our stress levels. I made earlier comments about the media and the impact that that can have on both vicarious trauma and our stress levels. Social media often gets mentioned as well in research around particularly depression and teenagers. We see a direct link between those two things and Facebook. In this plastic, fantastic world of Instagram filters, this is also not doing a lot of good for many people. There is an expression, compare and despair. And we find that many people are doing this with social media. Even though we know as adults, we look at social media and this is not necessarily an accurate representation of someone's life. We know this, but our brain can look at these pretty pictures, compare our life to someone else, and then we feel low about ourselves. How do you measure your success? And the reason that humans do this, meaning we compare our success and our achievements against others, is because it's also linked into our survival. Mankind is wired to connect and belong to our families and to our communities. So it very much matters if we're a part of our community, because then our chances of survival is greater. So we have been hardwired to care what other people think. And this is why our brain and our body hasn't essentially evolved for the kind of information that is coming at us 24/7, whether that is the news, social media, or constant barrage of notifications. So you might like to limit how much exposure you are getting at the end of a tough day to world news. This is another slide essentially pertaining to social connection, but slightly different. We talked colleagues last time. I'm going to ask you all to consider who's on your team. Who do you feel supported by? Who do you go to in tough times? Who can you lean into? For my introverts that are listening to this, that might just be one or two key people. When I say social connections, I don't mean 500 friends on Facebook. I mean, who do you trust? And trust is key. I also mentioned a term earlier, psychological safety. That's the same thing as trust, essentially. Do you feel safe telling someone about what's happening for you, seeking guidance, seeking support? So whether that is mentorship or just someone that you really enjoy talking to. Because if someone understands you, or you feel like you're being understood, you feel like you're being heard, that is so much more important than someone turning to you and saying, these are the top 5 best stress-busting strategies that you should implement in your life. Because this isn't empathy, this isn't active listening. So if you're actually looking to support one of your colleagues or someone in your network, it is a lot more about what you don't say rather than what you do say. How do you wrap language around empathy and active listening? When we do this, and active listening can be more around nonverbal cues, body language, eye contact, how do you support someone with language and without language? And what kind of language do you use? Because I can give you some ideas. I'm smiling already because I sound like a therapist, but have a think about, what does support look like for you? And when you're trying to support someone else, ask them, what can I do for you? I'd really like to support you with this right now. How can I help? What do you need from me? This is empathy, and we can be there for someone. And this links into pride that I was mentioning before. How often do you recognize your wins? So we need to start to celebrate those successes. And I remember many years ago, when I went back to start studying social work in my 30s, I made a decision that if I maintained a high distinction average for my first year, I would spend time on an elephant eco reserve in Thailand because I love elephants. It was a very big goal, and therefore it was a very big reward. But it can be small rewards for small wins and larger rewards for bigger wins. Celebrate as a team as well, because sometimes you might be facing so many challenges in your work that it is very important to look at what are we proud of, what is working, what am I doing well, what am I good at, how do I bring my signature strengths into the purpose of something bigger than me today. Now, that last question that I just asked you, I borrowed from a psychologist by the name of Martin Seligman. And he is the founding father of positive psychology principles. And he talks at length the pathways to happiness for humans. And this is a big area. What are you good at? And how do you use that in your work, in your home life, in your community work, with your faith-based communities? We can use our signature strengths in lots of different areas. But when we recognize what they are and we celebrate them, it really brings about a sense of well-being, especially in the faces of a lot of challenges. So any comments from the group in the chat box? What works for you? As there is no one size fits all best resilience strategy, some of you might be exercising, some of you might be staying socially connected. What are some self-care strategies that you enjoy doing? What does that look like for you? So I'm a big fan of walking, and I also love all things nature. And I find that I'm not alone. When I run sessions around the world and I ask people, what self-care strategies do you have? I find a lot of other people connect to nature. So it might be taking a walk in nature with someone that you love. It might be exercise, music, listening to online books. You might like to read, you might like to cook or bake, you might like to garden. Anything creative, anyone artistic. Those things that I just mentioned, everything from gardening to making that mind-body connection in the here and now, anything that takes your focus where you're not thinking about the 75,000 thoughts that our brain wants us to go through every day, when we're just mindful and doing something that we enjoy. This can be a really excellent strategy. And when it comes down to, well, what is the best one for me? It's simply, what are you likely to stick to? What do you enjoy doing? And what can you incorporate given your work and your timelines and other family commitments?